March 26, 1941. Bletchley Park, England. 11:47 p.m. A young woman sat at a desk in Hut 4, her index finger ink-stained from hours of transcription. Mavis Batey, 21 years old, stared at a page of garbled letters intercepted from Italian naval transmissions. The room smelled of stale tea and damp wool. Outside, England slept under blackout curtains. Inside, a handful of men and women bent over ciphers, hunting for patterns in chaos. Mavis had been working on this particular message for 3 days. Now, in the silence of midnight, the solution emerged. Within hours, this quiet moment would turn into one of the deadliest nights the Italian Navy would ever face. She did not shout. She did not call anyone over. She simply wrote down the plain text, her hands steady despite the cold. The message revealed the position, course, and timing of an Italian naval fleet operating near Crete. It specified coordinates, ship names, fuel status, and radio frequencies. It was in intelligence terms, a blueprint for ambush. Mavis set down her pencil. The ink stain on her finger seemed to pulse faintly, as though it carried the weight of what she had just unlocked. She did not yet know that within 48 hours, thousands of sailors would drown in burning oil because of this single sheet of paper. She did not know that her quiet calculation would trigger a catastrophic chain reaction across the Mediterranean, ending in a night of fire and screaming that would be recorded as one of the most decisive naval engagements of the war. What she did not know was that this message would decide who lived and who died at sea. This is the story of a woman whose invisible work led to visible catastrophe. Mavis Batey never touched a gun, never commanded a ship, never pulled a trigger. She sat in a quiet room and solved puzzles. But the consequences of her success rippled outward across the Mediterranean, ending in a firestorm at sea. Her name would remain classified for decades. The men who read her decoded message would receive medals. The sailors who died as a result would sink into silence. And Mavis would carry the knowledge of that night for the rest of her life, knowing that brilliance and violence are not opposites, they are partners. Before the war, Mavis Lillian Lever, not yet Batey, was a young woman from a modest London suburb. Her father worked in a quiet office job, her mother kept house. Mavis excelled in languages at school, particularly German. She was shy, careful with her words, methodical in her thinking. She enrolled at University College London to study German just as Europe began to fracture. In 1939, Britain declared war on Germany. Mavis was 19 years old. She did not intend to become a codebreaker. Few people did. The training was brief. Mavis learned to look for patterns, repetitions, cribs, tiny cracks in an otherwise unbreakable system. The work was painstaking. Most days nothing broke, but when something did, the impact was immediate. A decoded message could reveal convoy routes, U-boat positions, troop movements, bombing targets. Mavis worked in Hut 4, which focused on Italian and other non-German naval traffic. Operators sometimes reused settings, sent messages in predictable formats, or included phrases that could be guessed. Mavis, with her sharp eye for structure and her fluency in languages, became one of the best at spotting these weaknesses. She did not brag about this. She simply worked, quietly and relentlessly, through each shift. The ink stain on her index finger, a permanent smudge from constant writing, became her only visible badge of labor. By early 1941, the Mediterranean had become a critical theater. British forces needed to protect supply routes to North Africa and the Middle East. The Italian Navy, though large, had suffered losses and was operating cautiously. But intelligence on Italian fleet movements was sporadic. If the British could break the Italian naval enigma consistently, they could anticipate and counter Italian operations. That was the goal. Mavis Batey did not know, in March 1941, that she was about to hand the Royal Navy exactly that advantage. Intelligence was the margin between survival and disaster. Mavis worked long shifts, often overnight. She lived in billets near Bletchley, shared meals with other women in the canteen, and spoke to almost no one about what she did. Even her family did not know. Letters home were vague. "I'm well, work is busy, hope you're safe." The breakthrough came by accident, as many do. In mid-March, Italian naval operators transmitted a series of messages using a setting that had been partially compromised days earlier. Mavis noticed a repeated phrase at the beginning of one message, a standard greeting used by fleet commanders. She used this as a crib, working backward through the rotor settings until the rest of the message began to make sense. It took her 3 days. She filled pages with trial settings, crossed out dead ends, tried again. On the night of March 26, the pieces aligned. The decoded message was startlingly detailed. It listed the positions of 3 Italian cruisers and several destroyers operating south of Crete. It specified their planned route, speed, and timing for a rendezvous with other units. It even mentioned fuel limitations, which meant the fleet could not deviate far from the stated course. Mavis transcribed the plaintext carefully, her ink-stained finger moving across the page with practiced precision. She checked her work twice and handed it to her supervisor. He read it, nodded, and disappeared. She did not know that it was rushed to the Admiralty in London, that it reached Admiral Andrew Cunningham within hours, that Cunningham immediately ordered his fleet, then stationed at Alexandria, to intercept. She returned to her desk, picked up the next intercept, and kept working. But the chain had already begun. Admiral Cunningham received the decoded intelligence on the evening of March 27. He had been waiting for exactly this kind of information. Precise, actionable, and time-sensitive. In the Italian fleet, unaware that their communications had been compromised, proceeded along the route Mavis had deciphered. Cunningham ordered a night attack, a risky maneuver that required perfect coordination and surprise. His ships moved into position under cover of darkness. On the night of March 28, the British fleet opened fire at close range. The Italians, caught off guard, had no time to maneuver. Searchlights lit up the sea. Shells tore through hulls. Within minutes, 3 Italian cruisers were burning. Thousands of sailors jumped into the water. Some were pulled under by the suction of sinking ships. Others drowned in burning oil. The battle lasted less than an hour. By dawn, the Mediterranean was littered with wreckage and bodies. Back at Bletchley, Mavis heard nothing. News of the battle reached Britain through official channels, but operational details were classified. She read a brief mention in a newspaper a few days later. British naval forces engaged Italian fleet near Crete. Enemy losses reported as significant. She did not connect this to her own work. Not immediately. It was only weeks later, when a colleague mentioned the battle in passing and referenced recent intelligence breakthroughs, that Mavis understood. She had decoded the message. Her work had led to the ambush. The sailors who died, most of them young men, many of them teenagers, had been betrayed not by incompetence or bad luck, but by mathematics. By her. She did not celebrate. She felt a strange, cold weight settle inside her chest. She looked down at her hands, at the ink stain that had darkened over weeks of constant work. It seemed to carry a different meaning now. That weight would never fully lift. 3 weeks after Cape Matapan, Mavis sat in the Bletchley canteen with a colleague. They were discussing routine matters, shift schedules, the quality of the tea, whether the blackout curtains in Hut 4 needed replacement. The conversation drifted, as it often did, toward the war itself. Someone mentioned the Mediterranean. Someone else mentioned the recent naval engagement. They say it was a complete surprise, the colleague said. The Italians had no idea we were there. Mavis said nothing. She stirred her tea, watching the liquid swirl. She thought about the men in the water. She thought about the moment they realized they were trapped. She thought about the fact that her name would never appear in any report about the battle, that the sailors' families would never know who had decoded the message that led to the ambush. The distance between her desk and their deaths felt both infinite and non-existent. Brilliant work by our intelligence services, someone else said. Mavis nodded. She did not say I did that. She did not say I killed them. She did not say anything at all. What she did not know was that from that night on, Italian naval messages would be read faster and acted on without hesitation. One solution had opened a door that would never fully close. By mid-1941, the Italian naval enigma was broken regularly. Mavis's work had opened a door that others now walked through. British forces intercepted Italian convoys, anticipated attacks, and controlled the Mediterranean more effectively than they had in months. The strategic value was undeniable. The cost was also undeniable, though it was never calculated in official reports. How many sailors died because of decoded messages? How many families received telegrams because a young woman in England solved a puzzle? Mavis did not know the numbers. She did not want to know. She continued to work, to break codes, to pass along intelligence. She understood that her refusal to work would not save lives. Someone else would simply take her place. The machine did not need her specifically. It needed someone. She had been chosen. She had accepted. And now she lived with the consequences. But Cape Matapan stayed with her. Not because it was the only time her work led to violence. It wasn't. But because it was the first time she understood the connection so clearly. One message, one night, thousands of lives, there would be others. Mavis did not stop working. There was no time for reflection in wartime. The next intercept arrived, and the next, and the next. She continued to break codes, to hand over intelligence, to contribute to operations she would never see. But something had changed. She understood now what her work meant. Every decoded message was a potential death sentence. Every breakthrough was also a betrayal of someone, somewhere, who thought their secrets were safe. She was not unique in this realization. Many at Bletchley grappled with the moral weight of intelligence work, but few talked about it. The culture at Bletchley was one of quiet duty. You did your job. You did not ask what happened to the information you provided. Mavis followed this unspoken rule. She worked. She said nothing. Mavis decoded hundreds of messages over the following years. Some led to successful operations. Others were inconclusive. A few perhaps prevented disasters. She would never know the full scope of her impact. You solved a puzzle, passed it along, and moved on. The outcomes were someone else's responsibility. She finished the war at Bletchley. She married another codebreaker, Mavis Batey. They had children. She returned to civilian life. For decades, she told no one what she had done. The Official Secrets Act forbade disclosure, but even if it hadn't, she was not sure she would have spoken. What would she say? That she had helped win the war? That was true. That she had killed people without firing a shot? That was also true. She studied garden history, wrote books, worked on preserving historical landscapes. She lived a quiet, productive life. She did not discuss her wartime work with her children. When they asked what she did during the war, she said clerical work. It was not a lie, exactly. Code breaking was, in a sense, clerical, but it was also something far more consequential. Mavis knew this. The ink stain on her finger had long since faded, but the memory of that night in March 1941 had not. She thought about it often. She wondered whether the Italian sailors had families. She wondered whether they had been afraid in those final moments. She wondered whether they knew that their deaths were the result of a broken code, not a broken ship. In the 1970s, the British government began to declassify some Bletchley Park records. Mavis was finally able to speak about her work, though she did so cautiously. She gave a few interviews, participated in a documentary, attended reunions with other Bletchley veterans. She was praised as a hero. She accepted the praise with quiet discomfort. "I did my job," she would say. Many people did, but she knew it was more complicated than that. Heroism and harm are not mutually exclusive. She had helped end the war. She had also participated in killing. Both were true. Both would remain true. The men who commanded ships and led battles received public recognition. The codebreakers, especially the women, were forgotten. Mavis was one of thousands who worked in silence, whose contributions were classified, whose names appeared in no history books. This was not accidental. The secrecy around Bletchley was part of a broader pattern. Women's labor during the war, whether as nurses, factory workers, resistance operatives, or codebreakers, was often unacknowledged. The narrative of World War II centered on soldiers, generals, and statesmen. The invisible infrastructure that enabled victory was left out. Mavis lived long enough to see this begin to change. In the 1990s and 2000s, Bletchley Park became a public museum. Historians began to document the contributions of female codebreakers. Mavis was interviewed, honored, recognized. She received awards. Scholars wrote about her work. Schoolchildren learned her name. But even in recognition, something was missing. The public narrative emphasized triumph. Codebreakers who helped win the war. It did not dwell on cost. It did not ask what it meant to decode a message that led to mass death. It did not explore the moral weight carried by people like Mavis, who had to live with the consequences of their invisible power. Mavis died in 2013, at the age of 92. Her obituaries celebrated her intelligence, her modesty, her contribution to victory. They mentioned Cape Matapan. They did not mention the thousands of sailors who drowned because of her decoded message. That was not part of the story people wanted to hear. For the rest of her life, every quiet success reminded her of that first night. Mavis Batey spent one night in March 1941, solving a puzzle. That puzzle became a weapon. The weapon destroyed ships and killed men. The men were not her enemies in any personal sense. They were sailors doing their duty, just as she was doing hers. The difference was that her duty was invisible. Theirs was not. This is what intelligence work demands. The ability to act without seeing the consequences, to solve problems without confronting the human cost. Mavis understood this. She carried it quietly for 70 years. She did not seek absolution because she knew there was none. War does not offer clean hands. It offers only choices. Contribute or refuse, act or abstain. She chose to act. The consequences followed. Her story is not unique. Thousands of women worked in intelligence, logistics, resistance, and support roles during World War II. Their labor was essential. It was also hidden. Some were recognized late in life. Many were never recognized at all. Their work shaped the outcome of the war, but their names did not shape the narrative. Mavis Batey's name is known now, at least within certain circles. But the question remains, how many others are not? How many women decoded messages, carried intelligence, made decisions that altered the course of battles, and died without anyone knowing? How many sailors, soldiers, and civilians were killed by invisible hands, not through malice, but through duty? And perhaps that is the real cost of invisible power. Not the act itself, but the knowledge of what the act caused. Mavis Batey lived with that knowledge. She did not speak of it often, but it was there, always, just beneath the surface. A quiet weight, a silent war. How many lives were quietly ended by people whose names you'll never know?